Do you really need weights to build muscle, or can resistance bands and bodyweight exercises get you there? Can you build the same amount of muscle with 15 quid resistance band as you can with a 1,000 pound rack of iron?
Well-timed question. Why? Well, as we covered in last week's episode on what training variables really matter for growing muscle or hypertrophy, the American College of Sports Medicine dropped a paper 2 months ago that appears to be the most thorough review of quality scientific research into hypertrophy ever peer-reviewed and published. So we've drawn on this paper linked down below again, and our own literature search to compare and contrast the relative strengths and weaknesses of weight training, resistance bands, and bodyweight training for growing larger muscles specifically. If you're interested in this and applying scientific insights to your training to grow larger muscles, then this is the video for you. Is that you, Sam?
Yeah, frankly, it is. I've always been under the impression that I have to build a progressive overload, increase my weights over and over and over again. I mean, I've been doing it for the last 10 years. That's literally been the formula I've been following. I would love to know if there's a different way of approaching this, though.
Yes, well, I think that's going to be the kicker, isn't it? That I think progressive overload is still in, but we don't need to be progressing the weight that much. There are other ways of progressing, and what really matters is what we came to our conclusion of last week's episode is essentially you need to be training at more than 30% load of your 1 rep max, and you need to be working within 1 to 2 reps of muscular failure or 1 to 2 reps in reserve, and then 10 sets or more per muscle group. You do those things and your muscles grow to be able to keep moving forwards and keeping things at 30% or more and approaching 1 to 2 reps of failure. That essentially is progressive overload, because you're either going to have to do more reps in your set or you're going to have to do more weight as you go. It's just that the progressive overload for hypertrophy or muscle growth specifically doesn't have to be at as high a load as it would have to be if strength is your primary focus. So actually, perhaps it does have to be hard work because you're getting to 1 or 2 reps from failure, but it doesn't have to be back-breakingly heavy stuff. And perhaps there's something quite exciting in there for those that don't have a gym membership or travel often and find themselves in hotel gyms where the amount of weight that can be pushed around is quite limited.
I really like that. I was thinking about this as we moved on from the episode last week about hitting those volumes per muscle group set ranges. I was thinking it'd be really interesting to be able to keep an eye on where I am with respect to those targets of 10 plus and then up to 20 sets per muscle group. If you're telling me that I can also work out using resistance bands or bodyweight exercises to maybe hit those volume targets, this is amazing.
Well, who cares what I think and what I tell you? Let's see what the science has to tell us, shall we? So basically to do that, we'll go through each of these 3 training modalities that we've spoken of and say, what does the science say compared to a control where people aren't lifting weight? Does it grow muscles compared to not doing anything? And then what science do we have to compare and contrast first elastic resistance bands with weight training and then calisthenics with weight training? But before we do that, we'll do a quick gut check. Sam, what do you reckon comes out on top and why?
Surely it's weight training of the 3. I mean, maybe it's inertia. I'm trying to open up my mind and be a little bit more open to the idea of other things having the same impact. But yeah, if it all feels like the most sensible thing, progressive overload year over year, or maybe I'm just stuck in my old ways.
Well, I think probably it does seem like there's some community wisdom or community knowledge that essentially if you want to take growing your muscles seriously, you should probably go to a room full of heavy things and lift them up and put them down. I think, as we'll probably get into though, what really excels with that is once you're in that room, if you can afford access to that room, to the gym, you can move weights around in all different planes set up such that you can activate all your muscle groups. I think, as we're going to find out, if you can target your muscle group with sufficient load or weight per rep, then calisthenics can play a role, but you quickly end up falling out the bottom of that at least 30% of your 1 rep max needed to grow your muscles. And then with resistance bands, probably you need to get quite inventive. And one of the things that sort of strikes me as an inherent challenge is that basically the elastic band will just begin to sag. So you can do what you feel is progressive overload because you're doing more reps or you're moving up the bands or whatever it is. But actually the bands are weakening. As a confounder, perhaps instead of you growing and strengthening, you might think, oh, I did an extra 2 reps on my reverse fly or whatever it is with my green band, but it could be that your green band is just falling apart because you're doing so much work with it.
Now that's interesting. Yeah, I feel like as well, there's got to be some calisthenics movements that are just going to be like much higher than 30%. But as you say, there's going to be loads that'll be low, like around the 30 to 50% mark, which, as you say, when you progress over that point, kind of got to put those ones to the side. Interesting, mate. Tell me more.
Yeah. And there are probably some calisthenic movements where you can, start doing it one-legged or one-armed, and therefore keep the load up. But certain movements are not amenable to that. So I will tell you more. There's approximately no good quality peer-reviewed science published comparing all three of these methods in one study. So that's why we need to sort of break them apart and go through them one at a time. And we'll talk about each of them in time, and then we'll talk about, like I said, the ones where we've got two of them directly compared. So we'll start with weight training for hypertrophy. Okay, so this one, foregone conclusion. We all know that when we employ a few key principles of sufficient load, sufficient volume, and progressive overload, but that progressive overload is basically agnostic or doesn't care, will hold its nose as to what the form of weight is. It just needs to be that you're increasing the amount of good quality work you're doing, then muscles tend to grow. Anyone that's been in a gym and had all those newbie gains knows that. But yeah, it doesn't matter what we think. It matters what the science has shown to be true. So let's talk science. That review of reviews we've already mentioned employed pretty rigorous inclusion-exclusion criteria of what science they deemed worthy of their review. And all the studies included needed to last at least 6 weeks of training, be looking at healthy adults, and be of randomized controlled trial design. Within that, they found 17 systematic reviews of studies looking at over 16,000 volunteers and found that in the vast majority of cases, weight training, whether it's free weights or machines, helps you grow your muscles compared to not doing it. And the few cases where that's not the case, typically it'll be very advanced age, elderly people, or it'll be a short study design, or it'll be well-trained athletes who aren't having a progressive overload regime and they're essentially working within themselves. So yeah, 12 of the 17 systematic reviews said, yeah, absolutely, you grow your muscles when you lift weights. I think there was 3 that said it was insufficient data to tell versus the control group, and that leaves 2 that said that it didn't. But again, there's those confounding factors there. Generally, for most of us, most of the time, it does. Should we move on to calisthenics for hypertrophy?
Tell me about it.
Yeah. So firstly, we couldn't lean on that same view of all the reviews and science in the hypertrophy space because the researchers that put out that piece found 0 systematic reviews of calisthenics for muscle growth. There was quite a few looking at strength and other metrics of things that people might go to the gym for. But in terms of measuring calisthenics for at least 6 weeks in a randomized controlled trial for muscle growth, there's no systematic reviews that have ever been published on those studies. So sad face. What else is out there? What can we sort of lean on?
I want to quickly check. When we talk about calisthenics, we really mean bodyweight exercises, right? So it could be simple push-ups, sit-up, dips, chin-ups, those kinds of things. Or is it, well, as I interpret it, as a total like amateur, just doing cool shit on a bar?
Yeah, no, bodyweight exercises. That's an important thing to clarify. And probably bodyweight exercises better describes it. Makes more sense. But anyway, bodyweight exercises and calisthenics, when you search through that paper, they basically just say that no one's done a systematic review of decent quality science. The lower quality science does show that if you are able to train hard repeatedly and towards failure and load those muscles, then you can grow through calisthenics. But you tend to see a few exercise variants coming up in again and again in everything, which would be bodyweight squats and push-ups typically being studied. So I guess there are other exercises, and unfortunately I couldn't find a good one. There might be something out there. My suspicion, creeping suspicion, would be actually for your abdominals. Maybe you're not reaching your 30% of your potential 1 rep max and doing sufficient load if you're doing just sit-ups. Perhaps a lot of people could 1 rep max a loaded crunch machine or just cable machine. Probably a lot of us could 1 rep max quite a lot more than the effective load that we're applying. So I do think there are probably some common calisthenic exercises where we're not applying the load, but there would be some common ones where we are creating sufficient load. And I think a pull-up would be a good example, except that can be a bit inaccessible without some sort of assistance for people newly getting into the gym. And again, confounder, like, what is your body weight doing? It does make it harder to apply those principles of making sure you're getting your 30% or more, making sure you're progressing things, and making sure you're getting 1 or 2 reps from failure. So it does tend to grow your muscles, but it's pretty hard to focus on it. And the quality of scientific evidence and the volume is a long way down from weight training.
It's part of that also that's just far less measurable, as you say there. Like, I wouldn't like what you say there about sit-ups makes total sense, i.e., I could definitely crunch more if I was using the cables machine in terms of the actual effective weight. But because everything is measured against your own body weight effectively, it's just the movement that changes. Is that the problem there, really? Like, you can't do a progressive overload because, guess what? I'm not going to get progressively heavier as I start to do these exercises week over week.
Yes, we want to be measuring a total training volume. So that's the number of reps times by the number of sets times by the load or the weight we're moving. So you end up getting into this cycle of having to do loads and loads and loads of reps and loads of sets because the load's not high enough. But we do know that actually, if you want to be making good hypertrophic or muscle cell size gains, we need at least 30% off that 1 rep max. And that's sticky bit with calisthenics. And I guess the other sticky bit is at the other end. Some of the calisthenics movements are just too hard, and you can't just taper it down in the same way that if you've got a rack of weights, you're just like, there's loads of calisthenics things that I can't do. And if you can't start, how do you progress?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, like the, what are they called? Like the belts you put on where you can put a plate weight in between your legs. Then I was thinking, like, if you're doing like a backwards, like reverse flip or something, I was like, well, what's going to happen to the weight?
Oh my God.
It's actually not that simple. Yeah.
Some physics will happen to that weight. And that physics
on your head.
Physics may collide with your crotch or your head. Yeah, quite.
Yeah.
Oh, dear. Shall we quickly move on to elastic bands, elastic resistance bands for hypertrophy? And I'll try and call them elastic bands. I call them resistance bands normally, but the whole thing is resistance is there. We're moving, we're applying force against an object, and that elastic bands maybe makes a little bit more sense. So the good folk at the American College of Sports Medicine found 2 systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials of decent enough quality science to cut their mustard as they've laid out. And it looked at around 360 total participants. So it's pretty tiny compared to the weight-based resistance training. And one found that elastic bands training outperformed the control of not training for growing your muscles. And the other said there was inconclusive, insufficient evidence.
How frustrating.
Yeah. And I think, oftentimes if the effect is quite small, or it can take a while to bear it out, so you might need to run a study for a long time, or you might just need quite a lot of people. And some studies just don't show a result that is there, a positive finding that exists, because they don't run it long enough. They don't run it hard enough. Like if you give a resistance training program that's easily within someone's wheelhouse to someone who's already well trained, you might not get a result. Or they don't include enough people, so you don't get a big enough divergence of your population that are training and your population that aren't, because you need them to diverge far enough apart that random chance can't equate for any overlap. So anyway, I think that's what's probably happened there. And we'll get into why I think that by talking about calisthenics versus weight training, and then elastic resistance bands versus weight training. Firstly, body weight training versus weights and their effect on hypertrophy. Well, apparently, bodyweight training can produce an equivalent amount of hypertrophy compared to weight training when progressive overload is applied to both the group that are doing the bodyweight training and those that are doing the weight training. And this comes from a small study that compared sedentary, young, untrained women, half of whom went and did bodyweight squats and half of them did barbell squats. And they found that actually at the end of the study, which was a few weeks long, can't remember how many, both groups achieved significant and comparable increases in muscle thickness of glute maximus, rectus femoris, and their calf muscles.
Was that basically because they all started from zero with a sedentary young, so their percentage of 1 rep max was clearly well above 30% for both groups?
Yeah, I think having untrained individuals kind of, you almost end up getting the answer you're looking for. If you had extremely trained individuals who are putting, insane weights on the squat rack, then probably no amount of squats is going to be sufficient stimulus to grow their muscles. That being said, most of us are somewhere on
Yes.
that spectrum where we're not, sedentary young women, and we're not super well trained people who are loading up 200 plus kilos on the back squat. So interesting. And then there's a little bit of other stuff there. There was a study on progressive calisthenic push-up training, studied over a 4-week time frame. So again, not that long, and wouldn't have made the cut for what we've just been talking about, which showed that push-ups versus bench press led to increased strength, but a non-significant change in muscle thickness over that time. And that's, pretty much what's available for that. So questions before we move on to resistance bands versus weight training.
Yeah, nothing specific. I just think that it's interesting, isn't it? That there are these other modalities, and there is at least a little bit of proof that they might work, although obviously it's not conclusive. Yeah. Okay. Tell
Yeah.
me a little bit more about resistance bands.
So again, there's not a lot of evidence there. What I managed to dig up for elastic resistance bands versus weight training was just 2 small studies. One of them was elastic resistance bands versus flywheel training. Does that ring any bells to you?
Is that those things where you kind of roll it forward and you come back up? Is that a flywheel?
No, that's ab wheel.
Okay.
Flyweight training, I had to look it up because it's just not something that exists in any of the gyms that I've ever been into. It's a way of basically keeping the load constant throughout the whole range of motion. If you're lifting a free weight, gravity basically plays a different degree of force depending on where you are in the movement, and there's a curve of how hard you're having to work through the exercise that tends to yield things like sticking points. Flywheel training essentially is about trying to keep constant the load on the muscle throughout the whole movement. It's really unhelpful as a study because most of us don't have access to flywheel training. The outcome was that for the small number of people who were engaged in that study, elastic resistance band training was as effective as flywheel training for activating muscles. So it didn't even measure strength or hypertrophy, just muscle activation. Okay, that might therefore lead to strength and hypertrophy gains. We're here for hypertrophy. And then digging around in the dirt some more, I found a single study that took 29 middle-aged people that compared elastic band training with weight machines and measured strength, again, not hypertrophy, and found similar effects of both the elastic band training and the weight machines on the same muscle groups at 6 and 12 weeks of study duration.
Sounds more promising.
Yeah, so tentatively suggesting the following. I'll just lay out our conclusion. In conclusion, weight training is by far the most thoroughly studied modality for achieving hypertrophy or muscle growth. But looking across the broad span of available evidence, the following statement does seem to sort of hold true no matter what the form of resistance training or loading the muscle is. We can optimize for hypertrophy by performing at least 10 sets per muscle group per week of high quality lifting, where we use at least 30% of the load of our 1 rep max and carry out each set to within 1 or 2 reps of muscular failure, or only 1 or 2 reps left in the tank at the end of each set. Now, depending on personal circumstances, level of inventiveness, proximity to a gym, and willingness to go where there isn't that much evidence to back it up scientifically. And lots of people are pretty happy to lead their lives without that many scientific reviews guiding much of their lives. Then, it might be a mixture of these modalities that's best for you, or it might be other priorities that are different than just purely going after hypertrophy that will sort of decide what's best for you. For example, we've really not covered training for strength at all, but we know that this is much better optimized at loads that are 80% or higher of our 1 rep max, which can be really hard to do with calisthenics. And there are other training priorities as well that people throw in there. And as a little sort of aside or add-on, I did come across one really cool study that compared free weights versus weighted machines for both strength and hypertrophy gains. And it was quite interesting because essentially what it found is that specialization exists. We get better at the things we repeatedly do. So when they did strength testing on a machine, it was those that were training on those same machines that performed better. When they did free weight strength testing, those that were training free weights did better. When they measured for hypertrophy, there was no statistically significant difference between the two groups.
That's a bit of a bombshell. So it doesn't matter what you're doing, free weights or resistance machines, so long as you're progressive overloading, hitting those maxes, training in the same manner at least, then you'll get the same results in terms of hypertrophy. Is that right?
Yeah, the
Nice.
study didn't pick them apart for hypertrophy, but you'll get better at the thing that you do.
Man, personally, I've always, like, again, I'm a bit of like gym lore, always remember being told, always use free weights. And then sometimes when the free weights or the rack isn't available and you start, okay, I have to go on the machine, I guess, then, because I need to crack on. I always feel like, oh, okay, I'm kind of sacrificing a bit of my workout for this. But that is a big old bombshell to finish on, I feel like. Both, what is it, either free weights or resistance machines have the same effect as long as you're training the same way.
For hypertrophy, slightly different effects in terms of what other muscles you might be using. And I think one of the big things about machines is it forcing you into an unnatural movement pattern and position that could provoke injury?
But I will. I just want to get big.
Drop the bomb and wrap it up.
Nice one. All right, then.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching if you have been.